When we're dealing with the question of image of God, sometimes that can be confusing to people who are accustomed to maybe hearing that sort of language, but wonder, what does the Bible even mean when it says image? I think that Genesis 1 and 2, talking about male and female created in the image of God, is then explained and defined by literally the entire rest of Scripture. And so when we're talking about people being created in the image of God, I think that the language of icon is useful, not only in the sort of religious sense that we're accustomed to seeing it used, but even just in popular culture. We think of something as an icon of whatever, meaning something that represents something else, something beyond that person or beyond that thing. I think that's true for human beings. Human beings are created to picture God and God's care for, God's love of, God's rule over the rest of creation in a way that is to be recognized. And to be recognized even by, I think the Scripture teaches, by the inanimate creation in ways that sometimes it's hard for us to even understand. So when, for instance, in Romans 8, the Apostle Paul says that the creation groans for the revealing of the sons of God, there is a sense in which humanity is distinct because of the way that we picture and we image God. And there's been a disruption in the recognition of that because of sin that's being restored and reclaimed by the gospel. So when we're thinking of image of God, we're talking about dignity, but we're also talking about responsibility. And so sometimes people will say, well, that's really dangerous if you see this distinction between humanity and the rest of the world, because that means that human beings, because we're special, created in the image of God, that we can just do whatever we want to with the rest of creation. But that's not first of all, the kind of God that we're created to image. God does not treat the creation in a Pharaoh-like way, but also because our calling is to image God not only with just raw power, but with a power that's directed toward cultivation. And so you're to keep the garden, God says to Adam and Eve, and then to carry that task out to the rest of the world, which doesn't mean dominating. It means careful stewardship and cultivation over the rest of the world. When we do that, then we're imaging God.
In my best understanding, image of God was something that would be understood in the ancient world. In fact, as we read the Old Testament, we understand images are physical statues, physical things that represent deities. And the mind-blowing aspect is that we are God's physical representations on this earth. Now, I'm not saying God is like us physically, or we represent what God looks like physically, but we are God's physical representation on this earth, created to reflect and to represent His government, His glory, represent His rule over creation. So, as image of God, we are sons and daughters. As image of God, we are created as kings and queens. As image of God, we're created to be priests, which primarily means serving in His presence. And so all that within a covenant relationship for the purpose of mission. And initially with Adam was to be fruitful, multiply, and to reproduce this image over the earth. As God creates, and He creates in the animal kingdom things after their own kinds, He has created us after His own kind.
One of the greatest surprises in Scripture, when you think about it, is that Genesis 3 comes so quickly after Genesis 1. So in Genesis 1, we confront that incredible gift in creation where the human creature, male and female, alone is made in God's image. And a part of what that image means is to be spiritual beings and to be moral beings. And oddly enough, that includes the ability to rebel against the very Creator who made us in His image. And it comes so quickly. Just 2 chapters later, we're in Genesis 3, and they're Adam and Eve. The 2 creatures in the garden, the only 2 made in God's image, directly rebel against Him. It required the image of God to have such a capacity. We're surrounded by animals. They're not moral beings. They lack the capacity to know God as we know him. They are glory bearers, but they're not image bearers. As image bearers, we alone could sin, and we did. And then we come to Genesis 3 and the horrible reality of the fall in moral terms. And the question then has to come to us, does the image survive the fall? Does the image of God survive the sin, the consequences of sin, the corruption of sin, and the Creator's verdict and condemnation of sin? And I'm thankful that in Scripture we don't have to answer that question with our imagination. For one thing, it's repeated over and over again in Scripture that the image continues, that human beings are now, even now, made in God's image. And this becomes a part of the story of our redemption. God redeems the creatures made in his image who rebelled against him. But how do we know for certain that the image is still there and that the image is still the most consequential reality about what it means to be human? Well, there we go to Genesis again, but this time to Genesis 9, after the flood, when God makes with Noah what we call the Noahic covenant. And in that covenant, there's a distinction between the killing of animals and the killing of human beings. And what's the distinction? Because God made humanity in his own image. So there we have an absolute declaration from the Creator to Noah, not only on the other side of the fall, but on the other side of the flood, that the image is still there. So sin corrupts, and sin corrupts utterly, but sin cannot destroy the image of God. Sin does not have the power to destroy the Creator's creative work in the human creature and making the one creature in his image. Now, the corruption of the image means that what should be clear is now confused. What should be evident to all is now routinely denied by many. What should be the governing truth of every human being, understood by every other human being, is now in the midst of confusion and corruption. As prone as we are to forget, as prone as we are to fail to recognize any truth, as prone as we are to deny the obvious, sinful humanity will do that with the image of God. But even though it is corrupted, even though the knowledge of it is confused, it is there. And the Creator has not only declared that it's there, he embeds reminders in all of creation that it is there.
One major way that the image of God in us has been obscured by the fall is that we do not desire what he desires. We don't treasure as good the things that he treasures as good. We don't naturally call evil the same things that he calls evil. We don't embrace the tasks that he gave us from the first, like taking care of creation in a reasonable way or taking care of each other in a reasonable way. And these are very serious effects. We dishonor God when we move through the world in ways that are not like him. But the image of God has been preserved in us because God is much bigger and much more powerful than our sin. And so it can't stop him. It can stop us. We are small and feeble, but he is powerful, and he's able to redeem even the little that's left in us. And he shows that constantly through his work in the church.
So how is the image of God marred in us because of the fall into sin? Plainly, I would quote from Romans that says to us that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There is, in a real sense, the image of God that is to be reflected in us for his glory, a reflection of his glory to the world. And that has been marred primarily because the defining attribute of God has been abandoned by our rebellion against him, and that is his holiness. And so in our sin, we are perverted in our reflection of God, because the bottom line of sin is that God is holy and we are not like him. Connected to that is that we are still free moral agents who must choose between right and wrong, truth and error, good and evil. And that sustains the image of God in us. It is corrupted and perverted by the fall into sin, but we are still held accountable as free moral agents for truth and for goodness. And even with the corruption of the world around us and our own hearts, there is something in the culture still, with all of its perplexities and problems of sin, and something within us that still yearns for goodness and truth, even among those who deny those things as objective realities. We betray that image of God inevitably, as we are free moral agents made in His image in that regard, even though it has been tainted by sin.
Human beings are a very complex reality. In fact, we're almost a paradox, because on the one hand, we have great nobility as imagers of God, having been created in the divine image. Yet at the same time, we're fallen. We are sinful creatures. And if you want a picture of what that looks like, go to Romans 3, verses 9 through 20, and we learn that in our fallenness, there's none who does right, no, not one. There's none who seeks after God. You go back to Romans 1, 18 through 32, and you have a horrific picture of a world in rebellion against God. And so what we have to understand is, even though we are these wonderful, noble, gifted creatures made in the image of God, because of sin and depravity, we're capable of the most horrific things. Think, in courts in recent history of the Holocaust, where power is corrupted on a massive scale, and millions and millions and millions of imagers of God are stamped out and considered virtually worthless and useless. And so we have to recognize that on the one hand, there is this great nobility as imagers of God. At the same time, depravity in one sense has no depth to which it cannot go if it's disconnected from an understanding of who we are in relationship to God, and the value that each person should be deemed worthy because of that.
In Genesis 1, God describes human beings being made in His image and in His likeness. And one of the clues we get as to what this means comes in Genesis 5, when Adam has a son who is described as being in His image and in His likeness. So I'm pregnant right now with my third child. And as I look at my children, I see great continuity. I see their genetics. I see character traits that have come from me to them, and ways that they are socially like me. I also see ways that they're very unlike me, because they are different humans with different personalities. And I recognize that one day my children could grow up and they could turn away from everything I believe in and stand for. I think this gives us some insight into the relationship between us being made in the image of God and all of us being capable of extraordinary depravity. Our imageness of God is deeply baked into our DNA. There is no part of me that does not bear God's image. And at the same time, my capacity for sin is like a cancer. And it's not just like a tumor which you could amputate. So say, extract my anger or my envy or my lust or my pride, and the rest of me is fine. It's like a cancer that is metastasized throughout my whole body. So at this point, I don't just need an operation or an amputation, I need a radical cure. And I don't just need a life coach, I need a redeemer.